Hello, this is Botany and Plant Sciences 031, Spring Wildflowers. It's the second lecture of week 3. So we're in lecture 2, week 3. And today we're going to talk about plant reproductive morphology, and in particular within that subject, the morphology of fruits, of plant fruits. Last week we started seeing, last class, sorry, on Monday the 13th, we started seeing the morphology of fruits, and we saw basically the morphology of dry fruits. Today we're going to discuss the morphology of fleshy fruits. Let me share a screen with you. To summarize last week's class, let me go back a little bit. We discussed dry fruits into two categories. Dry fruits that open along suture lines and gradually release the seed into the environment that we call dehiscent. The act of dehiscing is the opening along a suture line, the opening of a plant pot along a suture line. So capsules, legumes, follicles, siliques, and silicles. And we also saw fruits that are indehiscent, that do not open, where the pericarp of the fruit, which is really the external part of the ovary developed into the fruit, stays together with the embryo inside and is released together, forms part of the dispersal unit, and is released together with the fruit. All indehiscent fruits have only one seed inside, one embryo, one viable embryo inside, as opposed to dehiscent fruits that normally carry a large number of seeds that is released as the fruit opens. And dehiscent fruits include nuts, which is a general category for large seeds that are dispersed by nut-gathering animals. It includes acorns, walnuts, pistachio nuts, pecan nuts, etc. Then it includes achenes that are basically like a nut, but are much smaller, like a small nut, normally less than a few millimeters long in the widest direction. It includes the caryopsis, which are the fruits of the grasses, basically. The caryopsis are in many ways similar to a nut, but the pericarp, the external part of the nut, cannot be separated from the seed. So the nut, the pericarp, like in the nut, not only forms part of the carrying unit, but is physically so adhered, so fused with the internal part of the seed that if you try to break the pericarp loose, like you would do peeling sunflower seed, for example, or pry opening a nut, the seed would die. So caryopsis is a special case of nuts with a very, very tightly attached pericarp. And finally, the samaras, which can be in many different families. And samaras are basically a nut, normally a single ovule structure with only one seed inside, where part of the external part of the ovary develops into a large papery wing that allows the samara to fly. So here you have an illustration of nuts, in this case an oak acorn. Nuts can be from many different families. Taxonomically, nuts are produced by many different trees from different families, from tropical trees to temperate trees. And then within the category of the smaller nuts, you have the achenes that are really small nuts. I showed you in the previous image the achenes of the sunflower family, in particular the achenes of sunflowers. But in the roses, for example, in the rose family, in the Rosaceae, there are some species that produce achenes, small microscopic nuts. And one of them in particular is the genus Rosa, the roses themselves that have this fruit. We're going to see the structure of a fruit that is called hypanthium, and the fruit itself is called a hip, and it contains the seeds are inserted inside in the form of a nut. And of course, here you have the samaras, which occur in a number of different families. Some are most commonly only one seed with a wing, although in a few species, the samaras can be two fused ovaries, with each one with a wing, and so they form a double wing, like a propeller unit that can fly in the wind quite well. So basically, this is a summary of what we saw last lecture. What I'm going to show you now, we're going to discuss, is within simple fruits that develop from a single gynoecium, the fleshy ones, fruits in which the external pericarp, the ovary itself, once it's fertilized, the ovary becomes a fleshy structure. So once the fruit is, the ovary is fertilized and the ovules become fertile and become seeds, the ovary itself becomes, in fleshy fruits, becomes a fleshy structure. The external part, the ovary, forms an external part of the fruit that is known as the pericarp. So the entire wall of the fruit, from the skin to the lining of the seed chamber, which is the entire ovary chamber, becomes the pericarp. Remember, we saw it when we discussed ovaries. Ovaries are transformed leaves, and like any other leaf, they have three layers. And there's an evolutionary memory of that. Most fruits have three distinct layers. Leaves have an upper layer, which is the upper epidermis, a middle layer, which is the mesophyll, and a lower layer, which is the lower epidermis. In ovaries, which are again the result of transformed leaves forming an ovary, it has, like a leaf, it has three layers. The external layer, we call it the exocarp, which means the external part of the fruit, from carpus, meaning fruit. The internal layer we call the endocarp, and the mid layer in all fleshy fruits we call the mesocarp. The three layers together are known as a pericarp, what surrounds the seeds. Let me show you some examples. The simplest example to understand is that of this fruit known as the drupe, that a large number of plants have drupes, like the apricots, for example, or the peaches, or the cherries. They're all drupes, especially in the family Rosaceae. The drupe fruit is very common, but it also occurs in a number of other plants. Have you ever, out of interest, broken the internal bony structure, what we call the bone of the fruit, in a peach, for example? You will see that inside it has the true fruit that looks very much like an almond, as a matter of fact, the true seed, sorry, with the two cotyledons and the embryo. So in a peach, for example, the external part of the fruit, the exocarp, is basically membranaceous. It's the external membrane that protects the fruit from drying. The internal part of the developed ovary, the endocarp, is normally highly lignified and very hard. It's a bony structure. In the middle, in between the two, the mesocarp is fleshy. And that is really, the mesocarp is the reward for dispersal animals. So basically, cherries or peaches or apricots, any of those fruits that produce drupes, the reward for the seed disperser is the mesocarp, the fleshy mesocarp. And through evolution and natural selection, the endocarp has become very hard. And the reason is very obvious. The plant doesn't, quote unquote, want a big animal to eat the seed. So it's protecting the seed. In many of these plants in the family Rosaceae, like peaches and cherries, the seed is also endowed with cyanide or with cyanide, technically is cyanogenic glucosides. They're sugars combined with cyanide that when eaten in your stomach, they release the cyanide. It's hydrolyzed by the acids in your stomach, and they can actually kill you. So basically, a drupe is a fruit that is enticing for animals or is attracting animals to eat the flesh, but is making all sorts of different efforts through natural selection to prevent the animals from eating the seed itself. And of course, the reward that they provide animals is for dispersal. What all fruits want is to be dispersed away from the mother plant. Basically, because if a seed germinates under the mother plant, especially in a perennial plant, in all likelihood, it will be outcompeted by the mother plant, or it will compete with the mother plant, but it won't actually extend the species and help to colonize new environments. Then the next structure in fleshy fruits is known generally as berries. And here I need to make a little parenthesis and explain this well. We normally call berries anything that is a fruit that you gather very often in the wild, in the forest, and is small. All those fruits in the market, they're called berries. In botany, the definition is quite different in English. In other languages, they don't have the word berries for this type of fruit. But in English, we call these fruits berries. And a berry is basically a fruit that has seeds inside the chamber, multiple seeds and not one. And the seeds are not protected by a fleshy endocarp. So you have a mesocarp that is membranaceous. You have an exocarp that is membranaceous, a mesocarp that is normally fleshy and provides reward, and the endocarp is normally also watery and fleshy. And the seeds themselves, the outer layer of the seed, they're normally small in berries, and they're protected enough to pass through the digestive tract of an animal. So berries actually are fruits adapted to be eaten entirely. The whole fruit is eaten, and the seeds normally can pass through the digestive tract of an animal and be defecated somewhere else, away from the mother plant. So the main difference between a drupe and a berry is in the case of a drupe, natural selection has favored fruits where the animal will try to munch off the mesocarp, the fleshy mesocarp, but leave the berry behind, leave the internal part of the fruit, the endocarp, the bony endocarp and the seed at some distance without eating it. In the case of a berry, the animal is expected to eat the whole fruit. It doesn't have a fleshy endocarp, and the mechanism of dispersal is that the seeds themselves are surrounded by a tight seed tegument, very tight and often hard seed cover or external structure that allows the seed to pass the digestive tract of an animal. An example of a berry, believe it or not, is a common tomato. The tomato is one of the most common berries, and if you look at the structure here, you will recognize immediately the type of placentation of a common tomato. There's one type of fruit that is exclusive of citrus family, the Rutaceae, that is known as the Hesperidium. The Hesperidium has an external exocarp that has oil glands, and you might have seen the oil glands in oranges or tangerines. When you press them, they release an oily substance that smells citric. Then it has a mesocarp that is white and normally not very enticing to eat. And then it has an endocarp that instead of being bony like in the drupe, it's membranaceous and it forms all the segments that form an origin that you can detach. So in the Hesperidium, The mesocarp is not fleshy, and the mesocarp does not produce a reward for the animals eating it. So what is the reward? Well, you can see all these are transformed carpels forming the fruit, many carpels forming the fruit. Placentation is axillar. The embryos are tied through the placenta to a central column inside the carpel. And all the rest of the space of the carpel is formed, believe it or not, by hairs, but not by hairs like our hairs that are dry, but fleshy hairs. That is, filament, filament-like structures that the plant produces that are succulent, that have juices inside. And you can see it very well if you open one of the sections of an orange and you open it and separate it apart, you will see that some thread like succulent threads will start coming out. That is the reward for the seed disperser. The fleshy thread-like structures that live, that develop inside each of the carpels. So this type of fruit is specific to the citrus family, and it's called a Hesperidium. Finally, two other fruits that are fleshy that we should know. One is the squash. The squash is basically very similar to a berry. It's like a gigantic berry, but it has an outer structure because it comes from a flower with inferior ovary. If you get a squash and you look at it, it has the pedicel of the flower turned into the pedicel of the fruit below, but the rest of the petals and the sepals and the stamens are here on top of the fruit. So this is formed from an inferior ovary, and the external part of the fruit is not the exocarp, but is really the mother plant, the epidermis of the mother plant that turns somewhat lignified and is called the rind. So in a pepo, it has an external rind that in some squashes can be quite hard and lignified. Then it has the endocarp, the mesocarp, and the exocarp following each other. The exocarp, the internal part of the fruit, is normally also rich in some fleshy hairs, like in the Aspergillium, but they're not transparent and totally juicy, but they're somewhat fleshy, and they can be quite sweet, which is the internal part of the pumpkin or the squash. And the seeds have parietal placentation. They're attached to the inner walls of the fruit through their placenta. And then within the subject of inferior ovaries, one last fruit that can be distinguished as a separate type of fruit is the pome. The pome occurs in a subfamily within the rose family, which is the apple and pear subfamily. Other plants like the loquat, for example, occur here. And basically, they have a similar structure to that of the pepo. If you get an apple, and next time you eat an apple and a pear, spend some time looking at it, you will see that it has the pedicel of the fruit attached to one part of the apple. And if you look at the other part of the apple, a sort of navel-like structure on the other side of the apple, you will see the remaining part of the flower. You will see the sepals, the petals, and very often the remains of the anthers on the other side of the apple. So this is also an inferior ovary. It's below the flower. And so the external part of the fruit, the external part of the ovary, belongs to the mother. And then the internal part of the fruit is the ovary itself. Very often when you cut an apple, you can see actually in the middle of the flesh of the fruit, you can see a line that separates the most internal part of the fruit from the external part of the fruit. This line separates what is properly the ovary from the external part, which is the part of the stem that surrounded the ovary that becomes fleshy once the fruit becomes fertilized. So here you have some illustrations of fleshy fruits. Here you have uh, um, a fruit uh, in its original native sort of ancestral state. In the tomato family's fruit tend to have only two carpels that form two locules, two spaces with, as I was telling you, with axillar central placentation. You can see here an apple where you can actually see the ovary itself here inside and the overgrown hypanthium, the maternal tissue of the inferior ovary surrounding the fruit outside. And if you cut it across, you will see the carpels with um, axial placentation. Berries. I got this from an old botanical textbook, and it's trying to be provocative. Berries include things as for some reason they have put only large berries. There are many small fruits that are berries too, but chilies, for example, or peppers are berries. Um, uh, the papaya is a berry. The eggplant, the aubergines, the eggplants are berries. And one very unlikely and provocative fruit is the avocado. You would think that the avocado is a drupe, as a matter of fact. But drupes have bony endocarp surrounding the seed, and the internal part of the avocado is not bony at all. It has terminal exocarp and then a sort of green, pale green, fleshy mesocarp and a fairly white endocarp that is not bony. And then the seed attached inside, surrounded by its own tegument. So, strictly speaking, avocados are either a drupe, a non-bony drupe, or a one-seeded berry. They're a really strange case in the classification of seeds. And here you have the poem, the same we saw here. Okay, we're going to finish this class with clustered fruits and multiple fruits. Clustered fruits develop from several separate carpels that are in a single flower. And there are three examples, all of them from the rose family: the blackberries, the strawberries, and the roses. And we'll see them in an image in a second. Let's go to the image. Uh, the blackberries and raspberries and red berries, all the family, all that group of fruits in the genus Rubus have a central receptacle in the flower. You can see that all the ovaries are superior. The rest of the flower is below the fruit together with the pedicel. But they develop into little drupes. So they're very, very small drupes with a bony endocarp, and you can feel it when you eat a raspberry or a strawberry. You can feel the little bony endocarp inside each one of these drupes. An accessory fruit is basically fruits like the strawberry, where it is not the ovary actually that develops the fruit, but the receptacle inside, the central column of the receptacle, that becomes fleshy. Strictly speaking, the developed ovaries are these little drupelets, these little achenes that you can see on the side of the strawberry. They're really a nuisance when you put a strawberry in a blender to try and make a smoothie. You want to filter those things because they get into your teeth and they're not really so nice to eat. So the reward for the disperser is not the fruit itself, but is the central part of the receptacle that becomes fleshy. 100% maternal tissue that becomes fleshy and is what actually acts as a reward for the dispersers. And the same, although perhaps completely the opposite, instead of having an extruding receptacle, the rose hips has an invaginated, an intruded receptacle with achenes inside. Each of this is a single flower. You can see the rest of the anthers and the sepals, the petals have fallen already. In the rose, petals are highly deciduous. They fall very easily. And you can see inside the hip, you have the achenes that are dry and not nice to eat. what animals eat in the wild from the rose hip is this external structure, which is the hypanthium. When we see that, when we see the rose family, it's an enlarged calyx that becomes fleshy and normally yellow to red colored and acts as a dispersal unit for animals to eat. Now, multiple fruits. Multiple fruits are formed from the clusters of multiple flowers. And they're not very common in the California flora, but they're quite common in other parts. For example, the pineapple is really an aggregation of fused berries that form what seems to be a single fruit, but it's really an aggregation of flowers initially that fuse into a large structure of fused berries. The fig, also known as a syconium, we'll see it in a second in the illustration, is a multiplicity of achenes, is a type of inflorescence, of enclosed inflorescence that develops into a fruit-like structure. And the sycamore is basically a multiplicity of capsules all clustered together. It comes from an original cluster spike-type inflorescence. So here you have an illustration of the sycamore that you see very well. They're all over Southern California on the streets. If you look at them, really the original structure is a round inflorescence in which each of the fruits forms a capsule, a one-seeded capsule or a follicle. They fall as a single unit, but it's really each of these quote-unquote fruits are really aggregations of capsules clustered all together. The syconium, the fig fruit, is really interesting and extremely important for California because California has become one of the big exporters of figs in the world, especially with dry figs, and it competes with Turkey in the international market for dry figs. The syconium is really a structure very similar to the hypanthium and the rosaceae, a closed structure that develops from an enlargement of the stem, and it has a series of flowers inside. So the syconium, before it becomes a fruit, it's an inflorescence. It's a closed inflorescence that forms like an sort of case with flowers inside. And that forces the pollinators to enter the syconium through the opening here on top. You might have seen when you eat a fig that it has an opening on top. So from the opening here, you get little wasps that are the pollinators of figs entering. And what wasps will do is they will deposit their eggs in the place where a flower is. And the larvae that grow from there will start eating the place where the placenta that feeds the flower is, and they get their food from that placenta. But many flowers will survive, and the whole fruit will become fertilized by this sort of weird process, a little bit like Rosemary's Baby. It's an external organism killing some of the embryos in order to get its own embryos there, but it pays for that service by pollinating the flowers. So there has been no counter selection to prevent that. The plant is actually, as I was mentioning in a previous class, paying for babies with babies. It's giving away some of its embryos in order to get the service of pollination. Somebody asked me then, he said, well, when I eat a fig, am I eating the larvae of the wasp that fertilizes? No. Normally, by the time the fig is ripe, the larvae are gone or are flown away, and you're not eating the fly that pollinated the fig. Although if you are in the wild, in the tropics, for example, and you find wild figs, and you might be wanting to eat them, they very often still have the larvae inside, and you can chew on a couple of little wasps when you eat a fruit. They're really nice, though. So basically, there are of course many other types of aggregate fruits. For example, the famous magnolia that we discussed in previous class is an aggregate of follicles. Each ovary it has a number of separated ovary. Each ovary forms a follicle with a seed inside. And as I showed you, I won't talk about all of them because it's going to be complex, but of course the blackberries and the raspberries are an aggregate of drupes. You can see here the central receptacle, all the ovaries that developed around the central receptacle forming a drupe, like a little tiny peach or a little tiny cherry that develops around the ovary. Here you have, of course, the pineapple, that is basically an aggregation of berries. Here you have the sycamore that has an aggregation of capsules, and finally the figs that are an urn, like a closed structure with an entry on one extreme where the wasps can come in and out, and inside eventually when it ripens it has a multiplicity of achenes. What you actually eat from the fig, what entices you to eat the fig, is the walls of this receptacle. The fruit itself is the microscopically little achenes inside that, like the achenes in the strawberry, you actually don't want to eat. But they use you for the trip, or they use animals for the trip, because the animal that eats the fig will actually and eventually defecate the seeds, the achenes that are quite hard, somewhere else and help very effectively to propagate the fruit. So I stop sharing here. And this is the end of our class on fruits. Next Friday, the 17th, we are going to discuss we're going to try and put together all we have discussed up to now, all we have learned up to now, and make some reflections as to the evolution of plants on Earth since a very old time, some 300, 400 million years ago. The first algae came out of the water, out of the ocean, into land, and started reproducing on a soil, on hard soil, instead of living in water. We're going to make a reflection on the evolution of these organisms on Earth, and how we moved from an ancestral alga to the current flowering, profuse arrangement of flowering plants that we have on Earth today. So thank you very much, and I'll see you next Friday the 17th with a lecture on the evolution of plants on Earth.